Well, okie dokie, we're moving forward again. Just a little bit left in the hopper for Ephesians, Matt. And those of you, again, I feel like if you've been watching Touchpoint at all, you do know that this is Matt Brumfield. You do that. My name's Miles. But just in case you're brand new to the situation, this is Matt. He's our online and connections pastor, and I'm Miles, our creative and production director. Almost messed it up there. But Matt, you've gotten a chance to teach through at this point now, by the time you guys hear this, a couple messages, but also just being in this series in general. I think just constantly being able to saturate ourselves in the value that this series brings in the online and connection space, especially as it relates to bringing people into North Canton Chapel, whether it be online or in person. For this to be our summer series, and we're almost done with it, how has this been valuable to you in the ministry that you do?
Yeah. So I think as we look at this, the beauty in Ephesians, so let's start there and then say how it translates into our online space. The beauty in Ephesians is so much as it starts, it's this idea of remembering and focusing back on the truth of this is who God is, and then also the truth of what he has done and what he says about you. Putting aside all connotations of what we believe he should say about me or about you or about that person, that maybe I don't want to speak that over them, but someone else does. And so I think it kind of resets and levels the playing field from right from the beginning of saying the real reality of all of us are broken, all of us are sinners, all of us are in need, whether we believe it or not, or see it or not. And then what unpacks this God who sees our need, that in his holiness and his being set apart provides a way. And I think that's so critical in a day in which we have so much just information that's thrown at us. And so as we're looking at online spaces, specifically to the North Canton Chapel, there's multiple ways. There's through our website, there's through recommendations on Google, there's through Google Maps. There's all these ways that I see that people usually ask the question, how did you find us? And sometimes it's searching, sometimes it's an algorithm that suggests it. But I think the beauty in that is when there is so much information, this series speaks the reality of, we need to reset our focus. And it's really hard. And as we've been moving, it goes from this, here's who God is, here's what he's done. And then if we are finding ourselves as that's part of our story, that God has redeemed us, that we are saying, I am his child, I have confessed Jesus as Lord, now what? And so I think even today with where we're going to dive in, what's really hard is there's a lot of things that want to say, no, you get a pass for this in your story. But when we say we are in Jesus' story, then there's things where it says, so everything I do now has to line up with what he has done and what he has called me to. And that's really hard. No,
and it's true. And so everything you said, if we were to kind of put a big package on it, is just that, through connecting people through a variety of mediums, Ephesians essentially is the calibrator that puts us back onto the thing that matters the most. And that's whether it's Jesus himself, just for the grace that he offers and extends to the individual, or whether it's Jesus, the unifying piece that brings us together in community and in growth. And today, I think that, to your point, we're going to talk about something that, isn't always that fun to rifle through. Because when we get in community and we start living life together, it's not all unicorns and rainbows, and that's okay. And the Bible's going to kind of coach us through a little bit of what that is. And so in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 25 through 32. I'll take up to, let's say, 29, and I'll let you take 30 and the rest. And so it says this, therefore, having put away falsehood, let each of you speak the truth with... looking past the microphone. Speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another. Be angry and do not sin. do not let the sun go down on your anger, and give no opportunity to the devil. Let the thief no longer steal, but rather have him labor doing honest work with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with anyone in need. Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as it fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear.
And do not grieve the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed for the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ forgave you.
Awesome. And so, obviously, it's not going to take a wizard to figure out like what we're trying to tackle today. There's a lot of things about, this idea of, if you're going to get mad, get about the right thing. But if you're going to get mad at all, make sure you do it in a way that also keeps the main thing about who Jesus is and what's the purpose of it all. It kind of rounds the bend and talks about that. But how does this passage inform us, not just about what we say, but the way in which we say it? So looking at this, there are things that are important, but there's a right way to go about talking about its importance.
And so I've sat with this, I think, because part of, for me, where I've been entrusted is our online spaces. Yeah. And so it's one of these where, so I think a good thing is for some, where we get very, maybe, as triggered isn't the right word, but we recognize maybe that I'm in a space and I find myself not being able to engage in the right way. And like, that's a good thing if you recognize that. For me, even if I recognize it's one of these where like, well, this is where God's entrusted me in this season. So I can't just say like, I'm not going to be on social. I'm not going to engage online. Yeah. But I think there is something in this, of talking about this idea of like, not living on extremes, right? When Jesus talks and he says, right, the way to him, is narrow, right? And even those who want to follow him is like, you have to, die to yourself daily and die to these things daily. And so there is a specific way in which to do this. And we see this here talking about, okay, you need to speak the truth. But this idea of, so we're members of one another, it talks about, right, that there's a way in which we do this that is not, right, where it says, don't let any corrupting talk. And so I think even in that, it's like, what's the language? And that's where it talks to. I think what happens sometimes is when we use truth, we throw labels with them that are not edifying. They're demeaning. And so they're putting down. And so I think like if someone has a different position or view than me, when I throw like a name in there with it, that's not me. Yeah. That's not edifying to them. That's not, hey, we're in this together and I deeply care about you. And from my place of remembrance of the God who saved me when I was lost, right? Who made me alive when I was dead. And so I think that's why all of this goes back to like, remember, when I'm in a place of abiding. And Jesus says that. He says, abide in me, for apart from me, you can do nothing. And there's other moments where he talks and he says, there's lots of things that people do that they'll say they did all these things in Jesus' name. Yeah. And so I think we do need to sit with that and say, not how do we have an absence of truth? I think that's the extreme. We either want to say, we have this truth, and as long as it's true, I can say it however I want, whenever I want it. Sure, right. And on the flip side, it's I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. Yeah. And it's like, we need to say the Jesus way is, how do I say it and recognize the way in which God has wired them in the season they're in, to say, meet them in that? Yeah.
So there's an interesting thing, because you're right. I think in our modern day context, when we say, like, there's two ways to look at this. Like, I think that if someone said, I am a Christian, like we just say that, I'm a Christian, I believe in God. I feel like in a Western context, that can mean so many things. Yeah. On its face, it's really hard to know what they mean when they say that. And so that's why we have to dig deeper. And sometimes we split hairs over what that can be. Some of it is important. Some of it is maybe not as important. Yeah. But then taking a step back even further, though, it's like sometimes like we are on completely different paths. And so when we look at, the first verse here, therefore, having put away falsehood, let one another, each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor. That on its own, we think about the context of what Ephesus was dealing with. There maybe was a little bit of like I'm attached to old beliefs or my old traditions that do not honor God in this way. And so it is a matter of like, okay, when we look at the church of Ephesus, and maybe we look at ourselves in contrast, right? When I see a brother or sister in Christ that is pursuing Christ wholeheartedly, and maybe just our doctrinal alignments aren't perfectly in sync in that moment, am I meant to be the aggressor in that moment? Or is it a matter of like, you are still either in process or you're still working through, or maybe even I don't know yet what I need to know, and God has to show me certain things. And so if I just believe one, we are together in this, and I want the best case scenario for both of us. And I'm going to admit that at one point in time, I was dead in sin, and God saved me, and I'm still figuring this whole thing out. If you take a level of humility to it, I think we can arrive to some conclusions together that don't feel like I'm attacking you as a person. Yeah. But in contrast too, there is a certain level of like, if you go rudimentarily, like last week's touchpoint, Pastor Alex, our group life and missions pastor, we talked a lot about the idea of the transition, like the old, transitioning to the new and the ways of life. And when is it wise to, give up on certain things because it draws you away from God? And when is it wise to maybe stay in community with people around certain activities that are not anti-biblical, but to other people, they're just like, I just want to be around you because of the influence that the gospel could have in this space. Yeah. And so the real question is, when we're talking about putting away falsehood, I think that I've watched people use this verse and passage somewhat maliciously to try and just like beat people down that are really just trying to figure it out. And it's like, how do we draw that line and figure it out? And so in that being said, I feel like the transition to the next thing, if this is one thing to ask you, is just like righteous anger. Righteous anger in our culture, especially you mentioned the idea of like having the opportunity really to steward our online spaces and how our outward facing stuff is with that. What role does relationships play in our words and speaking truth in those spaces?
And I think like you alluded to a lot of this. I think it's this idea of, do I know who God has entrusted to me? And so I think this is what's really hard. It's like, this is a God who is relational. And so I think what often happens is we think he is entrusted to us to win over a certain platform or position, instead of recognizing that he is the God of relationships, in which people that he's entrusted to us may carry a certain platform or position. But what's hard is that we associate, so I'm just going to correct or yell at anybody who's in this space, instead of this like, maybe, but I would say most likely, in the context of which God works, he has entrusted you first and foremost, to a local church. And your local church is going to be first and foremost like where you're going to find your community. And so I think even in the context of this, as Paul is talking, this idea of members one of another, it is this, yes, the global church, but I think we've confused that of, God has entrusted me every single person who claims that label of Christian, because we can all be connected or see someone's profile saying this. And it's like we waste so much energy on people that we don't actually even know. And I would say that we don't even actually know that Jesus has entrusted them to us. And that we think, because I'm saying this thing in truth to these strangers on a comment thread, that I'm being faithful. Yeah. And so I think like it does have to start of saying like, so what am I doing with those around me in my church? And I think there's some of that of this righteous anger of like, if there is someone I see in my local church context that I am in these daily rhythms where we're gathering here, that we are we are giving, we are tithing, we are worshiping together, that we are growing, that we are sitting under the teaching. And then there's something where like they're consistently living out. Like I think that would be a space where, okay, I'm going to be angry about if they are here and then they're harming others or not living out, or vice versa. I'd want someone to be angry if I'm in that versus Jesus trucker, like 1999, or like mom of the gospel, whatever, that I don't know, that's saying something and then I want to yell at them or whatever. That like, I think some of that is we have to just be cautious and take a step back and say like, who did Jesus entrust to us? Because I can't be responsible for, because it's not just correcting. When we see this, there's always like encouraging, exhorting. And even when correcting, it's like with gentleness. And so I think I'd always throw too, like if I'm going to be righteously angry about someone, like, am I also like interceding on their behalf? And so like I should have a prayer journal that matches up with my comment. And if not, like, I think that's where it's our line of like, I don't just get to say comments. I think that's what scares me as I've sat with is like online and connections pastors, like any comment I make, if it is coming out of anger or correction, if there's not prayer and intercession on the back end of that, I'm going to give an account to Jesus.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it is a tough thing. Okay. So like, not that we need to overly psychoanalyze the internet, social media, how people do what they do. I do think that there is a disparaging like incongruency with the people that are very aggressive online. When you talk with them, and if you know them, like their level of both personal accountability in their real life and their relational interests in their like physical life is definitely toppled towards I live a lot more on social media. I'm more aggressive on social media. I definitely take a certain heavy-handed position on things on social media. And while you can be very passionate about your points, I think to your point, it is just like, would you be so quick to press enter or submit if you knew that every word you say has that level of accountability attached to it, and especially if you take the position of assuming that you do know more than another person. I think the Bible is both specific and vague as to who the teachers of the Bible are. It says that they will be held to a higher standard, a higher level of accountability. And if anybody that is intense about what they believe and how they believe it is so devout in that specific thought that they would go and be very aggressive and like that way on social media, it's just something to consider the fact that the teachers of our day are just as much, they can be pastors, they can be clergy, but to be given the grace to know a truth, but the humanity and sinfulness to handle it in a way maybe that is overly aggressive and diminishes people's ability to see it in a healthy, grace-filled way, is something intense and scares me about how I would approach it. And so, and rightfully so, for you, you're like, I have to know that if I do this, I better have something walking in step right there with it, because if I'm going to speak to that person's soul in this moment, there's something that's going to go beyond this moment of pressing submit, pressing enter. And so I guess that's the part that kind of like, if anything, it just gator rolls right into the third question that I got to have is that, how does the depths of the forgiveness that we have shape the walk that we have as a child of God? And so I could even like angle it in a different way. How does the forgiveness that you're extended change the way in which you approach people in these levels of like disagreement or rebuke, I guess you could even say?
Yeah. No, and I think that is like the so this is where I will turn to like the the reality for those that like when everything kind of shut down in our world, where we are very much like we need to get back together. I'm with there are some things that need to happen in person. Now I don't throw off, because again, like I hate having to like pick extremes or like pick sides. Like like my side is always gonna be Jesus, but I'm gonna see like how does Jesus like make his way into this and move us back to him. And so I think even some of that of the I think we forget that Satan is like the deceiver. I think sometimes we want to make it like there are these moments where he is just clearly flat out wicked and evil, but I think it's that idea of deception. And so I think we get so deceived. I think that's even the idea of like with the way in which we portray truth, we forget that because Satan is deceptive, is that even if you're preaching that truth, the way in which Satan will twist that and distort it, not that you had any intention, but you don't know that person's story and what they're seeing. Like I'll even get this, to be honest, like there's times where I see people from NCC that post a meme or something, and there's the reality of the way that like Satan can sow seeds of doubt or like feed into that of like makes me doubt and be honest that like, oh, like, am I still a child of God? Like, am I still, and because I recognize like that's a way the enemy attacks me, right? And my flesh is broken and doubts in that way. I think I'm just probably more sensitive to that. And so I have to remember, okay, what has God said to me in the depths of forgiveness? And there's times where I have a lot of notes in my phone of things that I wanted to say. And sometimes like I had a whole, like I spent like 30 minutes in Photoshop Express and like I made a sick image and like had a whole post written out.
Yeah.
But if I wasn't abiding in Jesus, and there's been a few times where like I posted something and then 30 seconds later, like this conviction, and I deleted it. And so I think there's some of that of like, it doesn't mean it wasn't true, but I think I recognize that like, I mean, this was not coming to a place of where I remembered that Jesus forgave me, and it wasn't a backhanded jab of truth, even though like I didn't need those.
Sure.
But like to remember that this God who is holy, it was him through his blood that drew me near. And so I think there's times where I need to know, okay, this is something that needs said. And actually sometimes like my act of worship to Jesus is I am not going to say this. I'm not going to post this.
Right.
I am not going to do this. And that's not me being disobedient. I would have been disobedient even though I was like, oh, this is truth that people need to hear. I would have been disobedient if I posted that because I realized that I don't think this is going to be teaching with gentleness. And I don't think this is going to be edifying. In fact, it might be this corrupting. And Jesus hasn't asked me, right? He's the only one that can tear down that sin. Yeah. They can break through that shame. And sometimes he uses posts, and sometimes like my post is actually not his way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so week 7, like feels like, with Christy Stevens, I mentioned this idea of like palatability of truth, of like the word itself. Yeah. It's not that, and I feel like in other scenarios, people would have heard that and maybe just been like, yeah, I mean, the gospel's the gospel, or the word's the word, the Bible's the Bible. I should be able to say whatever I want, and it should come back clean. And I'm like, I mean, for sure, the word is great. You, as a messenger of it, can absolutely blur some of the ability to see it the right way. And so that's like what you're talking about, is that responsibility. Yeah. It's just like, man, with great power comes great responsibility. You know, I mean, if Uncle Ben can say it in Spider-Man, then, you know, we could say it right now, just relating to something as simple as, you know, you have a very strong but controversial message to the way the world wants to function. So knowing that, it's just like if you want it to land in a way that causes the most impact, you have to be very intentionally strategic about when do you insert that into somebody's life that is not going to hurt their ability to see it. Yeah. And so it's always this weird thing. It's like I grew up, you know, in the South where saturation evangelism was it. It's just like, do it all the time, all the time, all the time, all the time. There's never a bad time to say it. And that, for the most part, true, right? Yeah. People need to know about Jesus. Saying his name freely is a gift and honor, and we're thankful to be able to do it in our Western culture that we're in. But you're not wrong in that there's certain ways in which it's been used to pilot a idea or a thing that is not explicitly maybe what Jesus would want you to do in that moment. And so I think that higher level of spiritual maturity that you're talking about is just like the timing is just as important as the thing. And the thing, when kind of hitched with my own idea, can also make it not as helpful to begin with at all. I don't know. But forgiveness, though, is there at all like any part of this that like we need to be super like introspective, like self-reflective about our forgiveness daily that makes us change how we think about that?
Yeah, well, I think that's what you're talking about. Like when we want to, right? I think sometimes we want to attach like the gospel to more of a desire for this outward change or this outward, like to stop this outward thing in people, that we forget that the depth of the gospel is like, it always starts with I was dead, like inside all of me. And Jesus, right, forgave my sins and my trespasses. And so I think even in that, some of that is saying, what is my end goal? Is the reconciliation of fellow image bearers who are lost, who are dead, that Jesus can make alive. And so to trust that, okay, that the end goal is not to get them to stop being silent. It's that they're dead like I was, and Jesus wants to make them alive, and to see myself in that work of redemption, however he sees fit in his timing. And so I think that's where when we remember our forgiveness, we say, okay, it's not going to start with this outward thing.
Yeah.
It always has to start inward.
Internal. Absolutely. And so, yeah, no, I mean, this only proves just the fact that, like what we said before about how Ephesians, in our context, even if like online and some type of promotional piece got people interested in the door, it's this kind of stuff that ultimately grows us into a community of believers that can move towards seeing Jesus rightly, move towards furthering the church and the gospel message, with the understanding that not everybody is on the same page all the time. And so, no, man, I mean, I think that like this conversation is valuable, and I wish people had it more often. Right. And I think that you can agree with that, seeing and working through our online spaces. So, we're on week 10. So we've got a couple more in the hopper before we move into our fall series that's coming up here. I would imagine like this upcoming weekend, we're going to be talking briefly about it. It's our series called Undivided. But if you haven't heard about it, we're going to be trying to explore how do we navigate our world in a present situation of dealing with racial tensions across many lines, and trying to better understand how do we approach a multi-ethnic, multicultural approach to doing church, living life, and knowing Jesus as a whole. So, excited to get into it. Thank you guys so much for checking this out.